I am Calvin Smiley. I'm an assistant professor in the social department at Hunter, which is in New York City. I'm going to read stuff, but I have a couple pictures. Just want to let you know, they depict kind of violence. So, I mean, there isn't any kind of gruesome or anything there, but just as kind of like a trigger warning for folks, things like that. So I'll pass them to you when I'm ready to.
Sure.
So this work comes out of research I've done with men and women transitioning from incarcerated spaces back to the community. This work was both ethnographic and qualitative in methodology, with men and women coming back to Newark, New Jersey, where I did my field research. If anyone knows anything about Newark, New Jersey and the history about it, I can talk more about it later. But this idea around abolition really comes from groups that I was facilitating with them and their understandings of what abolition looks like and what they would want to see abolition in society. So I'll begin. In 1951, sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois stated, quote, "Either in some way or to some degree we must socialize our economy, restore the New Deal, and inaugurate the welfare state, or we descend into a military fascism which will kill all dreams of democracy or the abolition of poverty and ignorance or peace instead of war," end quote. Manning Marable synthesized this statement, writing, quote, "Du Bois recognized that America would eventually and inevitably come to a basic decision. Either it would move toward worker self-management, anti-racism, and a new democratic state apparatus, or would lapse into authoritarianism, racial barbarism, and militarization of the workforce," end quote. One might want to replace Marable's last word of militarization with prisonization, or maybe both. So now in this age of Trump in the United States, the future of mass incarceration, prison policy, and prisoner reentry is much more abstract. Under the previous administration of President Obama, he had gone as far as at least acknowledging that mass incarceration does not create better citizens. Yet the current president, with his brand of shooting off the hip policies, executive orders, and 3 a.m. tweets, shrouded in the law and order and, quote, tough on crime brashness, do not leave an optimistic sentiment, particularly in his comments about people of color, black folks, and people who are against him in general. So in December of 2018, Trump passed the First Step Act, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation that was to look towards curbing mass incarceration and helping people as they come out. But there's still a big question, or a question that begs, in what does sentence reform look like? So as many might know, prisons were devised in the progressive measure of punishment in the late 18th and early 19th century, as the methods of public humiliation, torture, and death were perceived as either uncivil or in the need for reform. Therefore, prisons became places of solitude for people to reflect on one's wrongs, where they imagined those who were wrongdoers would find God and change the error in their ways. But now, less than 300 years later, the question is posited on making this once seen progressive notion, quote unquote, better. So it is my humble opinion that reform is not enough, but this train of thinking must be challenged more radically. In this case, not utilizing language of reform, but abolition. If scholars, activists, and potentially policymakers believe that prisons have failed our communities, a shift in culture and ideology away from punitive measures must be undertaken, first through language and description. Not to sound reductive or simplistic, but emancipation of the roughly 4 million slaves at the end of the American Civil War was not a, quote, slave reform to make bondage better. It was abolition. If mass incarceration is the outgrowth or the bastardized legacy of that emancipation, as many scholars and historians have suggested, it is not only right, but our obligation to think of this issue not in the lens of abolition as opposed to reform. The optimistic hope of reform could easily and potentially have even more devastating impacts on our society in the name of law and order. As an example, let me introduce you to the white bear model that is presented in the science fiction television series Black Mirror. So here, we'll just pass these out. kind of in order. In an effort to appease both public outcry of reform and tough on crime efforts, the state looks to alternative methods of punishment and sentencing. Here we are introduced to a young black woman who awakens with amnesia in a house filled with pictures of a little girl that she has a distant memory of. Upon leaving the home, she finds people filming her on their cell phones, ignoring her cries for help as others with masks chase her with guns. She is helped to flee by a woman who insists that transmitters at the White Bear facility are controlling everyone. A car passing by rescues them, but instead takes them to the woods to be killed by these so-called hunters. The two are able to escape and begin their journey to destroy these transmitters. After breaking into the facility, a faux wall comes down, revealing a studio audience applauding. The mindless woman is confused and scared as she sees her rescuer and potential killers smiling and taking a bow. She is then strapped to a chair, and as a show host appears and explains to the woman who she is. Her name is Victoria, and she and her boyfriend have been tried and convicted of abduction, assault, and murder of a little girl in the images in the house. She is then paraded through the streets back to the house amongst jeering crowds of people. She is forced to watch home movies of this little girl while a memory eraser is placed on her head to prepare for the same events to occur the following day. Legalized terror in the name of justice. Only in the end is it revealed that the White Bear Justice Park is an innovative and interactive prison reform measure where, quote, justice is on display. Like a zoo or a theme park, visitors paid an admission fee to experience justice by fully immersing in a world of incorporeal punishment, otherwise what I call amusement justice. This dystopian future, while somewhat far-fetched, also reveals the many ways the storyline is closer than we might think. Programs such as Scared Straight, where adolescents are brought into prison environments to be terrified out of deviant behaviors, or places like the notorious Alcatraz Island, where tourists pay a fee to tour the buildings and hear the daring stories of escape. White Bear foreshadows the way in which reform can go backwards while still providing jobs, privatization, sentencing reform, and tough on crime policies. In the end, the state begins to profit off this scenario and becomes less interested in justice, but expansion of criminal sanctions that would place someone in a place like White Bear to continue profiting off this newly formed, quote-unquote, Justice Park. So based on my own research, working with men and women in Newark, New Jersey, going through the reentry process, particularly understanding the ways that they must navigate and negotiate a system that has released them with significantly diminished legal rights and amplified social stigmas, I describe various ways formerly incarcerated persons imagine a society without prisons. Through various focus group styles, we began to critically think about what society might be without prisons and what it would look like to develop various policy recommendations to end mass incarceration and promote prison abolition. So the first recommendation that a group of mostly black men came up with was the idea of restoration of full rights and citizenship. Restoration of full rights is an important step towards abolition. The loss of significant political, economic, and legal rights creates what I call a quote-unquote purgatory citizenry, where an individual is simultaneously an in-group and out-group member of society. Here, individuals must go through a various set of rituals as a way to atone for their past wrongdoings to highlight to society their mistakes. However, they are not granted full independence or allowed to become involved fully in society. Similar to the religious concept of purgatory, this punishment does not have a guaranteed end date, as some individuals never gain back all of their rights fully. So here Sam, a black man roughly the age of 33, stated, quote, "I was 18 when I went in to prison. I'm now 33. I couldn't vote in either Obama election and still can't vote. I think one simple way to bring people back into society is giving back basic human rights or just not taking those rights away at all," end quote. A second recommendation that these men and women had was restorative programs. Furthermore, restorative programs can be places of true innovation. Exploring alternatives to incarceration could be devised, specifically in the realms of housing, counseling and treatment, and employment. First, a study in Florida indicated that states spend roughly $31,000 a year on homelessness through law enforcement efforts of arrest, jail, and hospitalization fees, whereas giving a person a home and a caseworker could be as low as $10,000 a year. In an age of, again, quoting Trump, draining the swamp, this should be supposedly the goal, finding non-punitive ways that are also fiscally more responsible and important as an important direction to explore. Second, the area of counseling and treatment needs to be expanded. New York City's largest jail, Rikers Island, has more than 40% of its population that has been identified with mental health issues, which doesn't even include those who develop mental health issues once inside or as they are released. One story of one such young man, Khalif Browder, a New York City teenager who was held at Rikers for more than 3 years awaiting trial, ultimately took his own life after succumbing to his own mental health issues developed while at Rikers. Finally, exploring areas of employment are important. For example, things such as looking at alternative energy sources and green-collar economies, which could produce millions of jobs and skills that could provide opportunities to young men and women who currently have no alternative outlets. Ray, a black man aged 53, said, quote, "Locking folks up isn't doing anything for society. A lot of guys have some real potential and promise, just no direction, and putting people in these places, they can lose those talents. They have to come up with some new ways to get those talents through different programs or something." Another recommendation was the idea of termination for-profit criminal justice. The prison industrial complex in general, but in the case of reentry, the prison and reentry industry, has found a home for opportunistic entrepreneurs who see reentry as a way to make money. Many halfway facilities, and all halfway facilities in New Jersey, are privately run. During the time of my fieldwork, the largest halfway house corporation was Community Education Centers, which had a 1,200-bed halfway house, though bigger than some of the state prison facilities. Yeah, but it was called a halfway house. And it was directly across the street from Essex County Jail, so when Essex County Jail is full, they just spill over into the halfway house. So you have people who are transitioning into prison being housed in the same place people supposedly transitioning out. That place no longer exists. It is now an ICE detention center, so think about what it's doing. It was a big space, so they needed it. Anyway, CEC offered supposedly rehabilitative services, but their biggest appeal to the state was how they could be both be a political and economic win. Politically, placing individuals in these settings still keeps the quote-unquote tough-on-crime culture going, and economically, these places, because of their large size, are able to cut costs for Department of Corrections. Drew, a white male, age 37, said, quote, "These halfway houses are a racket. They have multiple people paying for the same bed, but only one guy is sleeping there. They don't give treatment or nothing. All they care about is the prison keeps sending guys, so they can keep making money from the state off of us." So just to kind of synthesize what he was saying, what I found out is at these halfway houses, what they can do is, say you're in your last year in your sentence, and they'll send you to the halfway house. If the halfway house, say, deems you good and you have a place to live, in your, last 6 months, they'll send you to that house. But you're still paying for the bed at the halfway house, even though someone else is sleeping there. So you might have multiple people paying for the same bed, and it's all a way for them to make money. Finally, the last thing that these men and women had described as a policy recommendation, but not really a policy recommendation, but something that they as incarcerated folks need to do, is what they called take it to trial. Well, it wasn't necessarily the most popular opinion. Many of the clients and participants I worked with did see the symbolic message being conveyed in the ideological stance of taking their case to trial. In a system where over 90 to 95% of all cases are dealt with a plea agreement, this effort would effectively sabotage the status quo and force the criminal justice system to take a harder look at what would be deemed important and credible cases to actually try. The Bail Project, which began in 2007 in the Bronx, New York, assists in paying the cash bail for individuals in order to get them out of the jail setting, pre-trial. The Bail Reforms Project data has revealed that roughly 90% of individuals held on bail plead guilty to the charges, whereas individuals who are able to exit these settings, the numbers are astonishing. In fact, 50% of all cases are dismissed, and in less than 2% of those that have received bail actually receive a jail sentence. So in other words, the system is reliant on holding bodies pre-trial and using this as a fuel of fear to create a climate of pleading guilty. The Bail Project has shown that the courts do not have the resources, time, or energy to try every case, and forces them to dismiss cases that either lack evidence or are essentially frivolous arrests. Some of the older men in the group had not taken plea agreements in their cases. These were guys who went away in the 80s and had done 25 plus years. All who had served 20 plus years. Gary, a black man aged 55, said, quote, "I can't speak for the young folks in here, but we, older guys, always took it to trial. Why let the state win by bending over backwards for them, right? Imagine if everyone said, nah, I'm taking it to trial, let's go to trial. It would implode the system." So finally, abolition as a concept was not hard for many of these men and women to comprehend. As individuals who spent years inside the system, they know the impacts that these institutions have. Abolition as a practice becomes more challenging, but not unrealistic. Many agreed that programs and other alternatives are the start, but cannot be the end all. It is not solely a responsibility of formerly incarcerated individuals to imagine or create abolition, but a collective response to oppressive regimes and punitive policies that promote negative outcomes in society, in particular communities of color. So to conclude, I challenge everyone to truly imagine a world without prisons and what this would look like to avoid white bear. Thank you.
I like that. I'm just interested in what you're talking about restorative programs, and you kind of gave some examples. But when you were talking about restorative, like, do you mean like restoring their position in the community as in to be able to kind of move forward like independently, or do you mean like restorative as in like a restorative justice concept about like how? Do you know?
I think they meant kind of both. Because
Yeah.
when I would introduce terms to them, they got it more. You know what I mean? Like, these guys weren't really, or not all of them rather, didn't understand when I would say like restorative justice. But when we tease it out or what that meant for them. But for a lot of them, they were also much more critical of the city that they lived in. I mean, most of these guys were coming out of Newark, New Jersey. So, they were like, us just coming back to Newark doesn't mean everything's going to be good, right? There's violence, there's corruption in City Hall. So for them, it wasn't just giving themselves, right? So for them, yes, they wanted the right to vote back, they wanted the opportunity to have employment, but they also wanted better communities. Mm-hmm. So they wanted a restorative justice that looked at both the individual and holistically at community, like a community restoration.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know much, but like Newark right now is Flint, Michigan 2.0, with high levels of lead, which they've known probably since 2006, 2007, and they try to put a Band-Aid on it by using these like filters, which they've also known don't work. And this was all under Cory Booker, who was considered like the shining young star of New Jersey Democratic politics, and now he's running for president of the United States. So a lot of these people are like, Newark has been the forgotten city, even though it's New Jersey's largest city. And you can really date it back to July 1967 when the Newark Rebellion happened, and along with the Detroit Rebellion, right? They're the two most costly and two most violent in terms of total injury and death. And people have kind of discarded Newark as this kind of black bad city ever since.
Yeah.
So for them, it's really making sure that Newark becomes also restored.